Hey girl, Marissa here. You are listening to the Codependent Dummy podcast. As a young woman, you have been raised, reinforced, and rewarded for putting the needs of others above your own. Now, in your 20s, you're finding yourself exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in shit relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. Codependency is a way of being where we put the feelings, wants, and needs of others above our own in an unconscious attempt to meet our own feelings, wants, and needs. Sorry to break it to you, sis, but that is not sustainable. This podcast is to help you undo all that so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. Let's get to it. Okay, today we have Joon Kim. As a former pre-medical student decades ago, Dr. Kim has firsthand experience regarding what it means to be pre-med. Though not a physician today, he has been helping students gain admission into medical school, as well as many other graduate programs for the past 18 years. Fun fact, he has taught all grade levels, as young as second grade up to currently graduate students. Thank you for coming on, Dr. Kim.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Any opportunity to talk about education, school, life, I am there. So
yes.
Thank you.
Well, no, we met and we talked about education, school, and life. And I was like, do you want to come on my podcast? This is great. So thank you.
Of course.
And first question, I ask everybody, how do you define codependency?
I'm a big fan of just the shorter the better. I think definitions, I think are more helpful when they're a little more succinct. So for me, the most succinct way I can define codependency is the unhealthy or excessive reliance on other people.
I love it. And the emphasis on excessive.
Correct. I mean, I definitely want to make the distinction that it's not bad to rely on other people, right? I mean, in fact, that could be a problem where you can't depend on other people, but it is this sort of excessive amount of reliance that it almost releases one's ownership of their own life. It's like, abdicating control over their own life. And so That's kind of where I draw the distinction.
And do you have any experience
myself
in your past?
I think I did, especially in my earlier years as the son of immigrants from South Korea. I think there was a lot of fear that drove a lot of my decisions, making sure that I was doing the right thing, making sure that I was doing things that were pleasing to my parents, which again in our customs, our tradition, especially as the oldest son, I need to be obedient. I need to be a high achiever. I need to bring honor and prestige to the family. And so there was this sort of unhealthy, excessive connection to my family members.
Right. A lot of pressure. Oldest son, honor.
It is. And sometimes what I have discovered through my decades of work with students in education is, that pressure may not even be explicitly coming from the parents or the family.
Right.
It's within the mind of the student, the individual themselves, that they sort of create this own self-pressure to excel and to achieve. And so for me, I think it really was this, oh my gosh, they did give up everything. They sacrificed everything to come to the US. And it was just our immediate family. That was it. Mom, dad, and my sister, the four of us left every family member and everything that we knew behind to come to the States. And so there was definitely a pressure to achieve. And we can certainly, I know we'll get to that at some point, because it's always inevitable that when I am working with students, that there are some elements of parallel.
Right.
And I think it also helps the student know that it's okay. I mean, we have all gone through highs and lows. And so I think that sort of humanizes the process. It normalizes some of the struggles that they're going through. And so, yeah, it makes for a much more interesting conversation.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I just want to highlight here the expectation from your parents was there. Right.
From my father specifically, yes.
Right. From dad. And in your work with students, you have noticed this trend where the expectation is there. And then some of us, I will say, like, I think that there were expectations of perfection, of getting good grades. I actually met someone recently and she remembered how my twin sister and our hair was always perfect, like perfect. It's like, I did my hair probably since like first grade, but I knew how to just get it perfect. So there's the expectation, but potentially I think codependence, we might take those expectations and run with them. Right. where yeah, it's like it's the stage is set, but then we really, right, this excessive, unhealthy ownership, internalization of the expectation.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the podcast, Dr. Kim, we have talked about therapists, social workers, nurses, right? These fields that tend to have a lot of codependence employed within them, or really encourage codependent behavior. And I wanted to have you on to talk about the medical field, and particularly doctors and physicians.
Right.
So with the students you've worked with, how have you witnessed hallmark codependent behaviors, right? Need to please, self-sacrifice, poor boundaries, etc.
Yeah, I think I've seen it in several sort of dimensions to the individual. Number one is their motivation for school. Like, what is the underlying motivation for pursuing an education? What helps them to drive towards certain fields? So in general, what happens with these individuals is their motivation has been basically outsourced. It is no longer about striving to seek personal curiosities about certain disciplines, but rather it's replaced by doing this for somebody else. And I think, again, this is where we need to go back to sort of the operational definition of how we're defining codependency, because it's okay that we do things for others, right? I mean, we might be thoughtful and pick up something, on the way home for a family member or a friend. That thoughtfulness is one thing, but what we're talking about is really just making a lot of these life decisions, personal decisions, based almost exclusively or predominantly on someone else. Right. And so when they do pre-med, right, that's sort of the usual moniker for a future as a physician is I'm pre-med. And these days, I believe something ridiculous like half of the college-bound students are pre-med. So their motivation for pursuing school is also very goal-oriented, which doesn't sound too bad, but we have to recognize that education, really the process is just as important, if not more important, right? I mean, we're talking about students these days where they want to graduate, but what about the learning that happens in between when you start and when you graduate?
Right.
So really focusing on that learning is important. So I would say motivation for pursuing school. And then of course, we could even spend quite a bit of time on like the name of the school, because again, for a lot of these individuals, the codependent, high achieving students, it's not just good enough to go off to college, right? I mean, we know that there's a whole hierarchy, unfortunately, of perceived prestige and how these schools are better than these schools. And so Motivation for school is one. I also see the lack of boundary between their intrinsic value of who they are as themselves, just purely based on you are your own individual, you are a person, and therefore you have value. You're precious. That's completely separate from your academic accomplishments and accolades. But when I am working with the student population that I do, those two worlds start to blur. Their perception and self-evaluation is really tied to their accolades and accomplishments. So if they do well, if they get a good GPA, they're happy, they like themselves. And if they don't do well, they're struggling, then obviously they are down on themselves, and it really hurts their sort of self-perception, their self-worth. So I've seen it in that way as well. Right. And then, one of the things that I see with parents, I think parents are very interesting. And I have worked with students with the parents in the picture, like actively involved, as well as parents out of the picture. And now that my wife and I, as parents, we have 17-year-old, 14-year-old, 7-year-old, I have the ability to see, through that parental lens. And one of the things I've observed about parents is parents across the board, regardless of background, culture, ethnicity, every parent, their main priority and goal is for their kids to be healthy, happy, and lead a productive life. I mean, that's all they really want. When we're talking about education, sometimes what starts to happen is their own experiences, the parents' own perspectives starts to bleed into their interactions with their kids. So even though they mean well, they start to inject their own sort of sometimes biases into their children. So for example, I'll use myself. So my father was in business, and he told me, don't go into business. It's what did he say? It's a dirty, profession where you are going to be testing the boundaries of ethics or something to that effect. He said, I want you to go into something that's noble, that's serving others, and medicine is the perfect profession. So again, he didn't force me, right? I mean, he didn't say, if you don't pursue medicine, I'm not going to pay for your school or anything like that. And I've actually worked with students where the parents did that.
Wow.
They actually said, if you do not major in this area, I'm not going to pay for your school. Right. You need to pay for it. And oftentimes, not surprising, those majors are in the sciences, whether it's science, mathematics, engineering, not paying for that art degree, And so the parents who mean well, unfortunately, their comments, their little subtle remarks starts to get internalized, and the student basically adopt that and have that incorporate into their own perceptions and thought processes.
Right. How was it when you didn't pursue medicine?
Yeah. So there's a lot more to the story, which again, I think I love it for the fact that I can share that with the students that I work with. And it very often they respond by saying, thank you so much for sharing that. It gives me hope. It makes me feel like, I can do this too. And what I'm talking about is I was actually dismissed from my undergrad institution. I was dismissed from the university, and it was based on a violation of a university policy. So long story short, when you're on academic probation, you cannot withdraw from an academic term. You must take all your courses and take grades in them. However, I did seek academic advising, to which the advisor actually told me to go ahead and drop the courses because I was just on the border with a 2.0. Because I had already been on probation 2 consecutive terms. And if you're on 3 consecutive probation, you will be dismissed from the university. So ironically, what I did to avoid being dismissed from the university ended up being the cause of me
Wow.
getting dismissed. But again, at that time, it was the end of the world.
Mhm.
It was the first time I saw my father cry.
Mm.
It was pretty devastating. But in hindsight, I can see that that was a remarkable incident in my life that really led to some very important changes. For number one, I would say that was one of the first moments where that codependent self sort of underwent a transformation because I had moved out. After getting dismissed
Mhm.
from the university, I moved out. I started working. I wasn't making a lot of money, but it doesn't matter. It's not about the money, but it is about discovering that self-reliance that, you know what, I'm making my own money. I am paying for my rent, albeit it was rough, right? I mean, the proverbial eating, ramen noodles and just really trying to get by. But that was exactly what I needed to take ownership of my education, my fate. And so ironically enough, when I was out of college is when I discovered, you know what? I really love learning. I want to go back to college.
Mhm.
Not because my father and all the expectations back home in our, home country, but I
Right.
wanted to do it. And so very fortuitously, I received a mail from the university that said, we have this new program to help students who never finished their degree. But we want to, invite these individuals like yourself that if you are interested, go ahead. I forget the exact details. I think it was like take 5 classes and get like a certain GPA or better, and then we'll take you back. So I was completely just thankful for that opportunity. I took 5 classes over the summer. I believe I got straight A's. I'm not entirely sure, but I know it was much better grades than what I was used to getting when I was in school. And so sure enough, I was invited back to the school. I went back. First thing I did was I changed my major. I
Mhm.
went from biology pre-med to psychology and education
Whoop,
because I
whoop.
was I was so fascinated. That's right. I just so fascinated with motivation,
Mhm.
just how people learn. So a little dabbled in a little bit of the neuro classes, and just it was a whole different perspective, a whole new outlook. I was no longer in school for my parents or my relatives. It really was about me pursuing something that interested me. But I think here's the critical sort of underlying epiphany that I think needs to be shared.
Mhm.
The two are not mutually exclusive, right? I think in my young mind, it was I have to do what they want or I have to do what I want. And what I came to realize was that the big fear and the reason why my father wanted me to pursue was he wanted me to have a stable income, have a profession that is respectable and doing something good. And so when I shared with him my new objective of going into education, he was actually happy.
Mm.
And my mom was thrilled because for her, she said, I knew it all along. I knew you were a better fit for education. I never said anything, which again, it was my, more vocal father who was
Right.
the predominant voice in the family. But my mom was ecstatic that I discovered education. And I still remember my very first real job, right? We always make that distinction between a fake job and real job. My real job was a middle school science teacher for LA Unified School District. And I remember signing that contract, getting my first medical health benefits and insurance. It was wonderful. And
Mhm.
so I definitely understand that that transition from a codependent sort of background to that self-discovery and independence is tough.
Mhm.
But for me, that's how it happened.
Wow. Wow. Right. I'm just, as you're speaking, right, you pointed out, and we were talking about these codependent behaviors. And then here you were totally flipping the motivation status. What status? You love
Right.
studying and you want to learn more about motivation and what, like, how people learn, and that intrinsic value, you start to really derive that from yourself,
Yes.
right? And you watched your dad cry for the first time. Oh my, oh, oh, oh. And also, like, I mean, talk about a codependent bottom, disappointing our parents and just finding your way on your own.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Well, I just really want to honor that story. Everyone let that sink in. Go back to the regular questions, our regular programming. Do you sense there is a connection between codependency and burnout in medical students? And if so, how?
Sure. There's definitely burnout. I see it as early as undergrad. And so what I mean by that is from for students that go from high school directly into college. And in fact, more and more students and educators are okay in accepting of what we would call a gap year or a gap years to be more accurate. There are
Mhm.
some students that they can use a little bit of time off after high school graduation to allow them to sort of figure themselves out, identify what are their goals, rather than just jumping into college, because there's this idea that you go to college to figure things out. And I have a slightly different take on that. Yes, it's true that when you are placed in an environment, a novel environment, new people, a new place, especially for those of you who might travel, distance to go to college, it is true. When you are in a new environment, that experience will help facilitate some of that self-discovery. But my thoughts also are that college is a very expensive place to sort of figure that out. And in fact,
Mhm.
from my own experience, it was ironic that I learned more about myself when I was outside of college
Right.
than when I was in college. And we could get into some, maybe perhaps controversial, conversations about how college is not realistic. It's not the real world. It's artificial. We can get into that rabbit hole. But, just suffice to say that, when you go from high school to college, you might not know what you want to do. And
Mhm.
so to jump into something where you're not quite sure, I think taking some time is a very prudent decision. So for example, even in human relationships, if there's some, topic or, matter that is a conflict, for example, do you just go and talk to that person without thinking about it and kind of giving yourself that time to think things through and process and then gather your thoughts and then go engage in a conversation with that other person? So that's kind of how I see it. Um, I would say like the most prominent connection that I see between codependency, burnout amongst pre-med and medical students. And some of those medical students I still do keep in touch with. So know that while I work primarily with students before they get to medical school, I still keep in touch, and many of them will reach out to me while they're in
Mhm.
medical school. So the connection there, I would say the burnout is oftentimes due to a lack of help seeking behavior.
Mm.
They struggle to ask for help
Right.
because we're talking about medicine where there's a certain expectation and pressure. So to ask for help, again, I often think we all would agree that it's a sign of weakness. Oh, you need help. You need help. But I think we've moved and made some really significant progress in reaching a point where there's less stigma. I'm not going to say there's no stigma, but there's less stigma in seeking help, especially in mental health. I think back in when I was in my teens, it was still seen as yeah, why can't you be tougher, right? I think there's also a cultural component too. I think in certain cultures it's frowned upon that yeah, that's just your mind is weak. That's why you're having these problems. So I would say it's that struggle to seek help from others. And so once that student is able to get the assistance, ironically enough, assistance from someone, that it's okay to ask for help, right?
Right.
And how does one get to that point? And hopefully, I mean, I really hope they don't have to hit absolute rock bottom, a complete breakdown, some other traumatic loss or incident in their life, that they have no other alternatives but to ask for help. I hope that's not the case, but I also know that the reality is there are some individuals where that is the only way by which they realize and accept that they can't do it on their own.
Mm-hmm. So hopefully they don't wait for a breakdown. But yeah, I mean, I know multiple therapists in my, arguably short career who, I mean, they have left the field entirely. But yeah, just really not being able to, right? We are the helpers. And so I think too, like a lot of times, like during grad school and even an internship, we compare a lot and we all think that everyone else is doing great. And then, yeah, there's not a lot of space for, or we question asking for help, right? How will I look in comparison to, looks like everybody else is doing okay. Everyone else is handling all these hours and demands and study. Yeah, it must be me. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, with the students you've worked with, right? Let's say they're not asking for help. Let's say they're basing their value on their grades, on the accolades, on the accomplishments, on external people. What does that tend to lead to if and when they get into medical school, or if they don't get in?
Sure. Well, certainly one of the hallmark, symptoms that if we can call it that, is a lot of emotional volatility. They have these really highs and lows. It's just a roller coaster of a ride for them. Mm-hmm. And that is, I love the word that you used earlier, unsustainable, because I think there are things in our lives that we are fine with it in the short term, right? Even, multitasking or a high level of stress for a short period of time, that's fine. But it's that sustainability or lack thereof that becomes a real key issue. And so for a lot of these students that have derived much of their self-worth, their identity based upon these external factors, and there's a lot of work that's been done by various education psychologists looking at things like mindset, right? And looking at the mindset towards intelligence, for example. Carol Dweck did some seminal work on mindset and young students, looking at whether if they were able to solve a problem, they were able to solve it because they were smart, right? So this is like a fixed mindset, like this is, I'm either smart or I'm not. Right. Or the kid said, it's a growth mindset, that the kid would say, I can't solve it right now, but if I study or if I try harder or if I, learn from others people, I can fix it in the future. I can solve it in the future. So this growth mindset. And so these mindsets are not just mindsets, but they're inevitably linked to motivation. And so the motivation is so important to our lives because, as we know, motivation has sort of this cyclical influence in our lives. When a student is really good at something and they're motivated because they're good at it, so guess what? They're going to do more of it. Well, what do we know when a person does more of something? They're going to get better at it. So there's practice effect. And so they get better and better and better. And then conversely, if someone says, I'm just not good at math, that's another expression that we hear, at least I did when I was teaching younger students, is I would have students tell me, oh, I'm not good at math or I'm not good at science. And so they're not motivated, and so they avoid. Well, what do you think happens when they avoid? They're not going to get better, and it's just going to perpetuate. So those are just some of the characteristics that I've observed. The other observation you just shared, but I think it's so important. It's worth talking about it further and for longer. It has to do with comparing oneself to others. Mm-hmm. That is hardwired into us. I don't know. I mean, if we were to look at it through let's say an evolutionary biologist's sort of lens, it might make sense. Like, yeah, you know what? I don't have to be the fastest in my herd, but I can't be the slowest because I'm going to get eaten by the predator, right? So you're constantly looking around and you're comparing yourself to others. But what I would challenge your listeners is this. Think about it. When you are doing science, frequently we hear this expression, compare apples to apples, oranges to oranges. It's basically controlling for extraneous variables. You're trying to isolate one variable that you're interested in so you can make somewhat of a reliable, valid conclusion. Mm-hmm. So when we're comparing, we try to keep things constant, don't we? I mean, if we're trying to look at, I don't know, the impact of group studying on student performance on exams. Is it better to study in groups or is it better to study in isolation? Well, we need to keep certain things, we have to control for those things. Right? We can't compare a high schooler against a college, compare against an elementary. There are certain things that we want to keep constant. Well, when we compare ourselves, it's interesting because there's all these, possible variables that would lead to us reaching a false conclusion, yet we don't think about those conclusions. So for example, when I'm working with these pre-meds, they'll say, I'm not a good test taker, but my friend did really well. They got, 90th percentile. I only got 70th percentile. Why are you comparing to your friend 90th percentile? Did you guys have the same upbringing? Did you guys attend the same high school? Did you guys have the same, MCAT prep course that you took? Do you guys have the same, instructors for all the science classes? There's all these variability. Yet that's never taken into consideration. It's just the bottom line. They got a higher score than me. Right. And so, but we also know that, sometimes logic isn't the only way by which we process information. We are emotional, creatures. And so we sort of have that, interaction between the two. Right. But hopefully this is where, the students can understand that that's right. Why am I comparing with that other person? And that's why, sometimes rather than just, and this is another important point, as a parent, you don't just tell people what not to do. Like, don't compare yourself, right? That's not very helpful. That's like going to the grocery store when I sometimes see parents say, hey, cut that out, knock it off. And it's kind of like, if I was a kid, I'd be like, okay, but then what do I do? So you have to kind of replace that maladaptive behavior with a more healthy, productive behavior. So in this case, rather than comparing yourself to all these others, okay, I'm not going to say compare yourself to someone who does worse than you, because sometimes I've had students say that, well, I'll just compare it to someone who does worse than I do, so I feel better about myself. That's not good either, right? Because again, in both situations, you're comparing yourself to others to develop a perception of yourself. And so this is where I'm sure everyone can figure out what I'm going to say next. Rather than compare yourself to others, you can compare yourself to yourself. Mm-hmm. That way you have the same parents, right? You yourself had the same upbringing. You went to the same high school. I mean, you are comparing yourself to yourself. Right. And so this is where you can also set goals. And what happens when we reach those goals, no matter how small, we get a shot of motivation. And that starts that sort of cycle of success. And so, I would definitely like to highlight that those individuals who keep basing their self on external factors, recognize that that's unstable. It fluctuates. And most importantly, you have no control over it. Right. Whereas for yourself, you have control over whether you're going to, study in the mornings or in the evenings, or study by yourself or study with other people. So knowing that if you are going to compare, that you compare yourself to you. Now, I think I know why, and this is where I do acknowledge that, especially because when we're talking about going into medicine or medical education, it is competitive. There are far more applicants than there are spots available. So this is where students will inevitably compare their test scores, their GPAs, their research experience. They will compare because, yes, you are theoretically competing against those other applicants for those limited spots. But so because that's the reality, you're going to just keep comparing yourself and keep being discouraged and just do worse.
Right.
It doesn't make sense. That is, I think, the definition of a problematic behavior, where you recognize it is not working. It's actually doing the opposite effect of what you want, but you continue to keep doing it. So don't compare yourself to others. Use yourself. And then also, remember earlier we were talking about sort of the prestige or the Ivy League, the ranking of the school. That is the same thing when we're talking about medical school. That is the same thing when we're talking about PA, pharmacy, dental school. All these schools, there's a hierarchy. And so what I try to do, and it doesn't happen in an instant, but over a period of time, I use my Jedi mind trick, and I get them to remind themselves that the goal was never to get into this med school or to get into that pharmacy school. The goal was for them to be a pharmacist or to be a physician or to be a nurse. And it doesn't matter which school you go to, you still get to be that professional.
Right.
The analogy that I use is, what's the difference between a Kia and an Audi? Like 80% markup on the luxury sports car, but what will the Kia do equally as well as the Audi? It'll help you get from point A to point B.
Right.
And so these are some of the things that, again, I think when we're talking about codependency, self-identity, attribution to, like, why was I successful or why wasn't I successful, but that person was, all of this starts to get jumbled and muddled. And so a lot of the students can use help sort of teasing that apart and reminding them and sort of simplifying. Remember, why are you drawn into this pre-med path?
Right.
Oh, it's because I want to be a doctor one day and help sick and ill individuals, not because I wanted to get into this top-ranked med school. So that was quite long, but I think it's definitely worth the attention because it is something that is so pervasive.
Right.
And I see so many students just devastated by it's unsustainable. Like you said, it's unsustainable to keep looking at what others are doing and measuring yourself with others. And we're talking about medical profession. You're going to help others. You're going to treat others. How are you going to treat others when you yourself are not well?
Right.
That you yourself are ill? I think we can agree that you're not going to be very effective helping others when you can't even be well yourself. In fact, I just recently traveled out to Denver for a meeting, and the first thing they tell you when they go over the safety procedures, right? When that mask falls, what do they tell you? Don't
put it on first.
Put it on first. You got to be safe and well before you can help other people. And so there it is, but again, it's a lot easier said than done. And like with anything, these types of habits, right? They take time to develop. We have to recognize the maladaptive behavior and then replace them with a more productive and healthy behavior. So
right. I feel very grounded and centered as you're talking about how you work with them, right? But just again, like not looking outside, right? Codependence. I've talked about this. We are so conscious. We aren't self-conscious. We're other conscious.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great way of putting it.
Right? I'm not self-reliant. I'm other reliant. I don't even know what I want. And as you were speaking to, right, a foundation, we don't have a strong foundation if we're just basing it off so many other people.
And so I just hear a lot of the work that you do is getting in touch with core motivations
Mhm.
and like just recentering, like don't look left, don't look right. Just focus on like, right, you want to be a doctor. Let's focus on that. Not like, oh, my friend got 90th percentile, or oh, my friend got into this school. Oh,
Sure.
I didn't get in this year. My life is over. It's like, is it really?
Yeah.
Any other ways, Dr. Kim, that you help your students focus more on what they want as opposed to what others want?
Yeah, spreadsheets are always very helpful. Students love spreadsheets. So creating sort of like a personal values and priorities, and then writing it out, maybe even writing out maybe the parents or whoever they're codependent with, what their priorities are, or what the students' perceived priorities of the other person's are, and really getting it down on paper, or these days on electrons on the screen, but to visually see what are important to you, what are your priorities. And then what I always like to do with the students is to examine those priorities against their time consumption. How are they using their time? Because they might say, oh, being pre-med is the most important thing, but then when I look, it's like, I don't know, working on their art project. It's like, well, have you thought about maybe adjusting your goals to like going into art? But no, I just do that, because it's how I deal with stress, which is fine. Just because you like to do something doesn't mean you have to make that your profession. But I think it's important that at least they get challenged with that sort of reflection back to them.
Mhm.
And when I do that, right, and I reflect back to them, hey, I noticed that when you talk about med school and being pre-med, you seem very angst and just wound up. But when you talk about research, like I noticed when you talked about research, like you just really had this light up in your eye. You're just passionate about the research. Have you thought about going into research? Because maybe it's not being a physician face to face with the patient, but maybe you're interested in discovering new therapies. Maybe you're interested in finding a cure for COVID-19, right?
Yeah.
And so they'll pause and, you know what? You might be, yeah, I love research. And it's kind of just, again, serving as that sounding board to challenge some of their preconceived assumptions. Because again, in their mind, it's no, I want to be a doctor, and I want to be a doctor. I'm doing everything to be a doctor, and I'm doing research because I want to be a doctor. And then they realize, actually, no, I was doing research because I like research.
Mhm.
And so it really is slowing things down. I think we all have examples, and we can relate that our minds go so much faster than our mouth, our talking out loud or reasoning. And it's just these thoughts. And also, not to mention that our thoughts, once they're sort of ingrained, unless we challenge them, they get pretty fixed. And it becomes really hard to change that.
Right. So slowing down. Priorities, values.
And challenging that, challenge and sort of reevaluate that. Is that really the case? Because if the time and your priorities, your values are not matching up, how do you reconcile that? Well, you can reconcile by saying, you know what, I'm not using my time the way I should, and then changing that. Or you can say, you know what, I guess I just love, teaching, because I'm working 40 hours a week on tutoring. Well, it sounds to me like you're a teacher at heart. So then you could adjust your goal, and not necessarily your behavior. So to
Mhm.
bring some, this is obvious. This is from Festinger's work on cognitive dissonance. So when there is a dissonance, that you need to sort of address that dissonance, and you can do that either by modifying your cognition, with the way you're thinking about something. So in this case, maybe, oh, I realized that I am really passionate about research and not medicine, and you change, you modify your thought process, or you change the behavior. Say, you know what, you're right. My priority is to become a clinician, a physician, but I am spending way too much time in the lab. I need to change my schedule around. So
That's how you help.
That is one of the ways. There's just a lot. And again, one of the reasons why I love what I get to do, and again, why I am totally fine with the path that I've taken and not towards medicine. I would argue that medicine, for the most part, gets pretty routine. That the patients come in, they are different, but in terms of the problem, the symptoms, what's going on is pretty routine. Things to repeat themselves. Whereas education, I think it's such a neat field because just like I would say your work as well, because people are coming in from different places, people respond differently. So what we're talking about is thought processes. People think very differently. Right. Whereas I think when you're in medicine, a heart's going to react the way a heart reacts in anybody's body. Lungs and kidneys, they function consistently. Now, obviously, one could argue, well, they have a slightly abnormal heart. They have a slightly enlarged kidney. I mean, we can get into that discussion. But, for what we're talking about in education and in counseling and therapy, it is very dynamic. It's very challenging because what works with one person doesn't work with another.
Mm-hmm. So. And if there is a budding pre-med student listening, where can they find you?
Well, I have an email. They could just email me at medschooladvising@gmail.com. And just, let me know your journey, where you're at. Love to hear about your journey. Like I said, I mean, it's something that I definitely can relate. I'm not a physician today. My doctorate is in education, ed psych. And I think the other thing that many students need is some of the realism, because what I mean by that is there's a lot of advisors in education today that are kind of on the extreme. Mm-hmm. They're either the rah, you can do it. Like you just got like fail in OChem and fail in, biochemistry. And they're like, you can still do it. That's not very helpful. No. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can't have someone, just because a student gets a C in their physics, you know what, maybe you should think about a different path. I mean, it's incredible that we do have educators who sort of operate on those extremes. And so for me, I really recognize, and that's why I practice with both sort of hybridization of what we would call tough love. I have a very honest conversation with students. And I will say, you know what, based upon those 2 Fs that you got right now, you are not likely to get in right now. And notice the key word, right now. Right. But here's what you can do. So my method is very much, it's a balance of encouragement, but a lot of that real conversation that needs to be had, because learning is all about feedback. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you're aware too, Marissa, when you're working with someone, to give them that feedback so I didn't realize I was doing that. Thank you so much. I didn't see that. Of course you didn't. I mean, we have blind spots. And so to help students recognize these areas that they can directly, improve upon, gives them a sense of empowerment. Like, oh, wow, like I can work on that. And I know what I'm dealing with. Right. And so they could just reach me at medschooladvising@gmail.com.
And you also have a group they can join.
Yeah, it's a Facebook group. It's kind of like my hobby. It's my way of sort of doing community service, if you will. There's a lot of great content on there. Everything's just accessible and free. All you got to do is just email me that you would like to join the group. I'll send you the link. And students use it as sort of like a Khan Academy video collection of various topics about what it means to be pre-med. I mean, all aspects of being pre-med. There's even some very technical components like writing your personal statement for med school and so forth. So I think it's a pretty cool website. And I think, students have said they found it very helpful as well.
Yes. Okay. Well, we will be sure to include that in the show notes. Thank you for enlightening us today.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to talk about this topic that I'm very, very passionate about.
Mm-hmm. Right. Focusing on balance,
That's
slowing
right.
down, priorities, values.
Yes. Yes.
It's Dr. Kim, you're helping medical students, and also I sense all the listeners, medical student or not, needed that
That's
reminder.
Right.
So
you're absolutely right. Education is important. Our profession, what we do for a living is important, but it's not the most important. We have to take care of ourselves, and we all have value. We're precious, we're important. It doesn't matter what we do, what box we check off on the occupation. I just want that to be the last message for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey girl, it's Marissa again. I'm not like a regular podcaster, I'm a cool podcaster, right? Thank you for listening and staying till the end. You can find me on Instagram at Therapy with Marissa. Email me, marissa@codependummy.com. Check out codependummy.com for more information on the show. And baby girl, a subscribe, rating, and review would be much appreciated. Till next time, I want you to remember, if you are feeling unseen, I see you. If you are feeling unheard, I hear you. And if you think that you don't matter, know that you matter to me. I want you to go out there so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. And now, the disclaimer. Girl, this is not therapy and I am not your therapist. This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, or guests are rendering any legal, clinical, or other professional service. If you want or need a professional, please find one.